The steady beep of machines filled the sterile hospital room like a mechanical prayer. Grace Catherine Sullivan lay unconscious, her pale face framed by auburn hair spread across the white pillow like spilled wine. Will Harrison clutched her motionless hand, his knuckles white with desperation. "You saved us both," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please don't leave us now." Detective Morrison cleared his throat from the doorway. "Mr. Harrison, we need to discuss Derek Sterling's arrest. The stalking charges, the kidnapping." 6-year-old Lily Rose sat cross-legged on the vinyl chair, her small fingers working methodically with colored paper. She folded another origami crane, the 47th since Grace's surgery 3 days ago. Each one a prayer, each crease a hope. "Daddy," Lily's voice was barely a whisper. "Why do angels have to bleed?" Will closed his eyes, remembering that terrible night at the warehouse. Sometimes saving someone meant sacrificing everything. Sometimes love demanded the ultimate price. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Charleston's historic district wore its beauty like an old debutante, graceful, weathered, and hiding secrets beneath layers of Spanish moss and peeling paint. The magnolia trees lined King Street in perfect rows, their waxy white blooms releasing a fragrance that spoke of old money and older sins. Rainbow rose pastel houses stood like painted ladies, each one worth more than most folks would see in a lifetime. Grace Catherine Sullivan pressed her face against the city bus window, watching the grand mansions blur past. Her reflection stared back, 24 years old, auburn hair pulled into a practical bun, green eyes that held too much hope for someone who'd learned early that hope could be dangerous. She clutched her grandmother's beaded purse, fingers tracing the worn velvet where anxious hands had gripped it through decades of worry and prayer. Inside the purse, $5.47. Not 500, not 50, 5. The last of her grandmother's emergency fund, saved for something special. Tonight felt special, even if it was probably foolish. The Magnolia Room restaurant sat on the corner of Meeting and Broad like a Southern belle holding court. Established 1924, the brass plaque announced proudly. Grace had walked past it hundreds of times on her way to double shifts at Sunset Manor Nursing Home, always wondering what it felt like inside, always knowing she'd never belong in such a place. Her reflection in the restaurant's window showed a girl wearing her grandmother's 1960s blue dress, the only nice thing she owned. The fabric was soft as a whisper but thin from washing, the hem carefully mended where it had caught on the trailer door. She'd practiced her smile in the cracked mirror of her Airstream that morning, trying to look like someone worthy of a real date. Derek Sterling's profile had been perfect. Food blogger, traveled the world, kind eyes in his photos. His messages made her laugh, made her believe maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. "Can't wait to meet you, beautiful. You're going to change my whole world." The hostess looked Grace up and down with practiced politeness that didn't quite hide the judgment. Southern manners demanded courtesy, even toward trailer park girls who clearly didn't belong. "Table for how many, honey?" "2, please. The reservation should be under Sterling." Across the room, Will Harrison cut his daughter's chicken into careful pieces, watching her small hands work origami paper with the intense focus that had worried every therapist they'd seen. Lily Rose had barely spoken since Sarah's funeral 18 months ago, communicating mostly through drawings and paper cranes that seemed to predict things before they happened. Tonight, she'd folded a figure that looked suspiciously like an angel. The minutes crawled by like wounded things. Grace sat perfectly still at her table by the window, hands folded in her lap, watching every person who entered the Magnolia Room with the desperate hope of a shipwreck survivor scanning the horizon for rescue. The waiter had refilled her water glass 3 times, each visit accompanied by increasingly concerned glances. Her phone showed 7:45 p.m. Derek was 45 minutes late. She pulled up their text conversation again, reading his last message like a prayer. "Can't wait to see you tonight, beautiful. 7 p.m. sharp. This is going to be perfect." The words blurred slightly as she stared at them, willing them to mean something they clearly didn't. Around her, the restaurant hummed with quiet conversations and clinking silverware. Couples shared appetizers and laughed at private jokes. A family celebrated what looked like an anniversary, grandparents beaming at grandchildren who squirmed in their Sunday best. The normalcy of it all made Grace's isolation feel sharp as broken glass. At the table across the room, Will Harrison found himself unable to concentrate on his daughter's careful origami work. He kept glancing toward the young woman by the window, drawn by something he couldn't name. She had arrived with such hopeful energy, straightening her vintage dress, checking her reflection in the window glass, smiling at nothing in particular. Now she sat rigid as a statue, and that smile had become a mask of forced composure. "Daddy, she's crying," Lily whispered, her first words in 20 minutes. Will looked more closely. The young woman wasn't crying, not visibly, but there was something in the way she held herself, the careful control of someone fighting not to fall apart in public. He recognized it because he'd worn that same expression for months after Sarah's death, pretending strength he didn't feel. Grace's phone buzzed. Her heart leaped, then crashed. The first message was a photo. Derek Sterling grinning at a rooftop bar, his arm around a tall blonde in a designer dress. The caption read, "Real date night. Sometimes you have to upgrade." Then came the texts, one after another like slaps. "LOL, you actually showed up. Did you really think I was serious? I saw your trailer park address when you gave me your number. Come on. Nothing personal, but I have standards. Maybe try dating in your own league next time. Thanks for the entertainment, though. My followers are going to love this story." Grace's hands shook as she read them. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Pretty is as pretty does, sugar. Some folks are just ugly all the way through." But knowing that didn't make the words hurt less. They carved into her chest like they were meant to, each one designed to make her feel small, worthless, grateful for whatever scraps of attention someone like Derek might throw her way. She looked around the restaurant, suddenly convinced everyone was staring. Everyone knew she'd been stood up. Everyone could see exactly what Derek saw, a girl from nowhere with nothing, playing dress-up in her dead grandmother's clothes. The waiter approached again, his expression gentle but firm. "Miss, I hate to ask, but we have people waiting for tables. Would you like to order something or—" Grace's voice came out as a croak. She cleared her throat, forced the words past the lump of humiliation lodged there. "I'm sorry. My date seems to have been delayed. I should probably go." She reached for her purse with trembling fingers, opened the clasps, and stared at the $5.47 that represented the sum total of her worldly wealth. Not enough for even an appetizer in a place like this. Barely enough for the bus fare home, if she was careful. "Actually," she said quietly, "could I just get the check for the water?" The waiter's face softened. "Oh, honey, don't worry about that. Water's always free." The kindness in his voice nearly broke her. Grace nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and stood on legs that felt unsteady. She smoothed down her dress, her grandmother's dress, worn to celebrate what was supposed to be a new beginning, and walked toward the exit with as much dignity as she could manage. She made it 3 steps before her phone buzzed again. One final message from Derek. P.S. Delete my number, and maybe invest in some actual clothes before your next date, if there ever is one. This time, Grace couldn't stop the tears. They came sudden and sharp, blurring her vision as she fumbled with the restaurant door. Behind her, she heard the soft murmur of conversations continue, oblivious to her pain. The magnolia-scented Charleston air hit her face like a benediction, but even the beauty of the historic district couldn't touch the ugliness Derek had planted in her heart. She had believed him. She had hoped. As she had dared to think that maybe, just maybe, someone could love a girl from Riverside Trailer Park who worked double shifts and counted pennies and dreamed of saving lives instead of her own bank account, what a fool she'd been. Will Harrison had made his fortune by reading people, their needs, their fears, their unspoken desires that drove them to buy his company's pharmaceutical solutions. But he'd never seen raw heartbreak quite like what he witnessed across the Magnolia Room that evening. The young woman by the window had transformed before his eyes, hope crumbling into humiliation so complete it made his chest ache. "Daddy," Lily whispered, her small fingers pausing in their origami work. "The angel lady needs help." Will glanced at his daughter, surprised. Lily rarely noticed other people anymore, lost as she was in her own quiet world since Sarah's death. But her dark eyes were fixed on the young woman with an intensity that reminded him uncomfortably of Sarah's intuition about people in pain. The woman was gathering her things now, moving with the careful dignity of someone holding themselves together by sheer willpower. Will watched her fumble with a small beaded purse, saw her shoulders shake slightly as she read something on her phone, witnessed the moment when her composure finally cracked, and tears began to fall. Something in Will's chest twisted tight. He knew that particular flavor of devastation, the kind that came from daring to hope and having that hope thrown back in your face like it was nothing. Like you were nothing. Sarah's voice echoed in his memory from their last coherent conversation before the cancer took her ability to speak. "Promise me something, Will. When you see someone drowning, don't wait for permission to throw them a life ring." He signaled the waiter, Marcus, who'd served the Harrison family for years, and spoke quietly. "The young lady by the window. I'd like to cover whatever she orders tonight. And Marcus, bring her the seafood pasta and the house salad. Tell her it's from a friend who understands that sometimes the world forgets its manners." Marcus nodded, understanding immediately. The Magnolia Room had been serving Charleston society for nearly a century, and Marcus had seen his share of cruelty disguised as social graces. Will watched as Marcus approached the young woman's table just as she stood to leave. Her confusion was evident. She glanced around the restaurant, clearly trying to identify her mysterious benefactor. When her eyes met Will's across the room, he saw something flicker there. Fear, maybe, suspicion. The wariness of someone who'd learned that kindness often came with strings attached. He rose from his table, Lily's hand slipping automatically into his. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's go say hello to the angel lady." "Is she really an angel?" Lily asked, speaking more than she had all week. "I don't know," Will admitted as they crossed the restaurant. "But she looks like she could use some friends." Up close, the young woman was even more striking, not in the polished, artificial way of the Charleston debutantes Will typically encountered, but with a natural beauty that spoke of character rather than cosmetics. Her vintage dress was clearly well loved, mended in places, but it suited her perfectly. She wore it like armor, like something precious passed down through generations. "I'm Will Harrison," he said gently, offering his hand. "This is my daughter, Lily. We couldn't help but notice you seemed, well, frankly, you looked like you could use some kindness tonight." The woman stared at him for a long moment, clearly trying to process his motives. "I don't understand. Why would you? I mean, I can't." "It's not charity," Will said quickly. recognizing the pride in her voice, the same pride he'd heard in his own mother's tone when his father's business had nearly failed during Will's childhood. It's just one person recognizing another person who deserves better than whatever just happened to them. Lily stepped forward, pressing a small origami crane into the woman's palm. "Mama used to say cranes carry wishes," she whispered. "Maybe you need wishes tonight." The woman looked down at the delicate paper bird, and Will watched her face transform. The careful composure melted away, replaced by something raw and real and heartbreakingly genuine. When she looked back up, her green eyes were swimming with tears. But they were different tears now. Not the bitter tears of humiliation, but something softer. Something like gratitude mixed with disbelief. "I'm Grace," she said quietly. "Grace Sullivan. And She swallowed hard, clearly struggling. "I don't know why you're being kind to me, but thank you. I really needed someone to be kind tonight." Will felt something shift inside his chest, something he'd thought had died with Sarah. Not love, it was far too soon for that, but recognition. The recognition of finding someone whose heart beat with the same rhythm as his own, someone who understood that life could be cruel and beautiful in equal measure. "Well, Grace Sullivan," he said, gesturing toward her table, "would you mind if we joined you for dinner? I have a feeling this is the beginning of something important." Grace looked between Will and Lily, these strangers who'd appeared in her darkest moment like answers to prayers she'd been afraid to pray. She thought of Derek's cruel words, of her empty trailer and emptier bank account, of all the reasons she should be suspicious of rich men bearing gifts. But Lily's small hand was warm in hers, and the origami crane felt like a promise. And sometimes, just sometimes, you had to choose trust over fear. "I'd like that," she said, and meant it. "I'd like that very much." The weeks that followed that evening at the Magnolia Room unfolded like pages in a story Grace had never dared to write for herself. What began as a single act of kindness grew into something neither she nor Will had anticipated, a connection that transcended the obvious boundaries of class and circumstance that should have kept them worlds apart. It started with coffee. Will had mentioned, almost casually as they'd parted that first night, that he often worked from Palmetto Cafe on King Street, just a few blocks from Grace's bus route to Sunset Manor. "If you ever need a quiet place to study," he'd said, "they have the best Wi-Fi in Charleston." Grace had walked past the cafe 3 times before she'd worked up the courage to enter. Through the windows, she'd seen Will at his usual corner table, laptop open, reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed what looked like pharmaceutical reports. Lily sat beside him, her origami paper spread across the table in careful patterns only she understood. "Grace," Lily had called out when she spotted her hovering by the door, and the genuine joy in the child's voice had melted Grace's last hesitation. That first coffee meeting had stretched into 2 hours. Will insisted on buying her lunch. "You can't study on an empty stomach," he'd said with the authority of someone who'd clearly made that mistake himself. And Grace found herself sharing stories she'd never told anyone, about her grandmother's wisdom and her parents' dreams that had died with them, about the elderly residents at Sunset Manor who'd become her chosen family, who'd taught her that dignity didn't depend on bank accounts or zip codes. Will listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that stories mattered, that they revealed the shape of a person's heart. In return, he shared his own struggles, the overwhelming responsibility of single parenthood, the weight of running a company built on his father's legacy, the way grief for Sarah had nearly destroyed him before Lily's needs had forced him to keep living. "Some mornings," he confessed during their 3rd coffee meeting, "I wake up and forget she's gone. For maybe 30 seconds I think I hear her in the kitchen making breakfast. And then I remember, and it's like losing her all over again." Grace's hand had covered his across the small table, her nursing instincts recognizing the particular ache of unprocessed grief. Healing isn't linear, she'd said gently. The residents at Sunset taught me that. Some days you're moving forward, some days you're moving backward. But as long as you're still moving, you're still living. The friendship, for that's what they carefully called it, grew organically. Grace began stopping by Palmetto Cafe between her morning and evening shifts at Sunset Manor, using the quiet hour to study for her nursing boards. Will, she learned, was funding a research initiative into pediatric medications, work that had become personal since Sarah's illness. Their conversations ranged from pharmaceutical ethics to the challenges of raising a selective mute child to Grace's observations about the healthcare system's failures with elderly patients. Lily, meanwhile, had begun to bloom in Grace's presence like a flower finally receiving proper sunlight. The child who barely spoke to anyone else would chatter freely with Grace about her origami animals, her drawings, her complicated feelings about her mother's absence. Grace never pushed, never tried to be Sarah's replacement, but simply accepted Lily exactly as she was, a brilliant, sensitive child processing trauma in her own unique way. "She's different with you," Will observed one afternoon as they watched Lily demonstrate how to fold a paper butterfly. "More like she was before Sarah got sick." Grace studied Lily's concentrated expression, the way her small fingers moved with such precision and purpose. "She just needs someone who speaks her language," Grace said. "Kids like Lily, they see the world differently. They feel everything more deeply. That's not something to fix, it's something to honor." The words hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Because somewhere in those coffee shop conversations, somewhere between Will's gentle teasing about Grace's stubbornness and Grace's ability to make Lily laugh until her sides hurt, something had shifted. The careful boundaries they'd maintained were beginning to blur. It was Marcus from the Magnolia Room who finally voiced what everyone else had begun to notice. Grace had stopped by the restaurant to thank him for his kindness that first night, and he'd smiled with the wisdom of someone who'd watched Charleston society's dramas unfold for decades. "Honey," he'd said, "I've seen a lot of folks come through those doors, rich folks, poor folks, broken folks, healed folks. But I ain't seen two people look at each other the way you and Mr. Harrison do and call it friendship. That man's in love with you, sure as sunrise. Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Grace had protested, of course. The gulf between their worlds was too wide, the complications too numerous. She was a trailer park girl with $5 to her name and dreams that might never come true. He was a pharmaceutical executive with a mansion on Rainbow Row and a dead wife's memory to honor. It was a recipe for heartbreak, not happiness. But the heart, Grace was learning, had its own logic that had nothing to do with bank accounts or social expectations. And when Will looked at her across that cafe table, when he listened to her opinions about drug pricing with genuine respect, when he trusted her with his daughter's fragile heart, when he saw her, really saw her, not as a charity case but as an equal, it became harder to remember all the reasons they shouldn't work. The turning point came 3 weeks after that first dinner during what had become their regular Tuesday afternoon coffee meeting. Grace was reviewing flashcards for her nursing boards when her phone rang. The caller ID showed Sunset Manor, and Grace's stomach immediately knotted with worry. "Grace, honey, you need to get here fast," came the voice of Dolores, the head nurse. "It's Mrs. Patterson. She's asking for you, and the doctor says it might be tonight." Mrs. Eleanor Patterson had been Grace's favorite resident since her first day at Sunset Manor 2 years ago. A retired schoolteacher with sharp wit and boundless kindness, she'd taken Grace under her wing like a surrogate grandmother. More than that, she'd been the one person who'd known Grace's parents personally, who could share stories about their dreams and their love for the daughter they'd never seen grow up. Grace stood abruptly, her study materials scattered. "I have to go," she said, her voice tight with panic. "Mrs. Patterson is dying, and I don't have a car, and the bus won't—" "I'll drive you," Will said immediately, already closing his laptop. "Lily, sweetheart, we need to help Grace with something important." The drive to Sunset Manor was silent, except for Lily's quiet humming from the back seat. Grace stared out the window at the familiar streets of Charleston, thinking about Mrs. Patterson's stories, about the way the old woman had insisted that Grace's parents would be proud of the woman she'd become. "She was my grandmother's best friend," Grace said suddenly, needing to fill the silence with something other than her growing dread. "She used to tell me stories about my parents, about how they met, how excited they were when I was born. She's the only person left who remembers them as real people instead of just names on a tombstone." Will's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "Then we'll make sure you get to say goodbye properly." At Sunset Manor, Grace rushed through the familiar hallways with Will and Lily close behind. Mrs. Patterson's room was dim, filled with the antiseptic smell of impending death that Grace knew too well from her nursing training. But the old woman's eyes lit up when she saw Grace approach. "There's my girl," Mrs. Patterson whispered, her voice paper-thin but warm. "Come here, sugar. I have something important to tell you." Mrs. Patterson's weathered hand gripped Grace's with surprising strength, her faded blue eyes burning with an urgency that made Grace's heart race. The old woman's breathing was labored, each word a struggle, but her voice carried the weight of secrets too long kept. "Grace, honey, I should have told you this years ago," Mrs. Patterson whispered, her gaze darting briefly to Will, who stood respectfully near the doorway with Lily. "About your parents. About what really happened to them." Grace felt the world tilt slightly. She'd always been told it was a car accident, tragic, sudden, final. Her grandmother had never wanted to discuss the details, claiming it would only bring more pain. But something in Mrs. Patterson's expression suggested there was more to the story. "What do you mean?" Grace asked, leaning closer to catch every precious word. Mrs. Patterson's eyes filled with tears. "Your daddy, William Sullivan, he was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. He had a partner when he started that pharmaceutical company, young man named Harrison. They were going to change the world, develop medications that could help children with cancer, with genetic disorders." She paused, breathing heavily. "But Harrison's daddy, old Charles Harrison, he was a different breed. Greedy, ruthless." Grace's blood ran cold. She glanced back at Will, who had gone very still, his face pale as understanding began to dawn. "The night before your parents died," Mrs. Patterson continued, "your daddy called me. He was scared, Grace. Said he'd discovered that Charles Harrison had been doctoring the books, stealing money from their research funds. Your daddy had proof, was going to expose him the next day. And then—" She trailed off, her breathing becoming more labored. "Mrs. Patterson," Grace whispered, "are you saying the accident wasn't an accident?" The old woman's nod was barely perceptible. "The sheriff back then, he was Charles Harrison's golf buddy. Called it mechanical failure, but your daddy was meticulous about car maintenance. He just had the brakes checked the week before." Tears rolled down her weathered cheeks. "I was too scared to speak up, child. Charles Harrison had power in this town, and I was just an old school teacher. But I kept the documents your daddy gave me that night. They're in my safety deposit box at First National. I've been carrying this guilt for 16 years. Grace felt the room spinning around her. Everything she'd believed about her life, her family's tragedy, had been built on a lie. Her parents hadn't died in some random accident. They'd been murdered to protect a secret. And the man standing behind her, the man she'd come to care for more than she'd admitted even to herself, was the son of their killer. She turned slowly to face Will, and the stricken expression on his face told her he was connecting the same terrible dots. The pharmaceutical company he'd inherited, the wealth that had built his comfortable life, the legacy he'd been so proud to continue, all of it was built on blood and betrayal. "Grace," Will said hoarsely, "I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know." But Grace couldn't speak. The weight of revelation was crushing her chest, making it hard to breathe. The kindness Will had shown her, the genuine care, the way he'd seen her worth when no one else had. Had it all been guilt? Some twisted form of penance for his family's sins? Mrs. Patterson squeezed her hand one final time. "Don't let the past poison your future, child. The son isn't responsible for the father's sins. But you deserve to know the truth." Her voice was fading now, her strength finally giving out. "Your parents loved you so much. They'd want you to choose love over hate, forgiveness over revenge. That's who they were." Grace sat frozen as Mrs. Patterson's breathing grew shallower as the monitors began their inevitable decline toward silence. The woman who'd been her last link to her parents, who'd carried their secret for 16 years, was slipping away. And with her went the last certainty Grace had about who she was and where she belonged. Will approached slowly, as if she were a wounded animal that might bolt. "Grace," he said softly, "please let me explain. Let me help you process this." She looked at him, really looked at him, trying to reconcile the man who'd shown her such kindness with the son of a murderer. His face was carved with anguish, his hands shaking as he reached toward her, then dropped them as if he had no right to touch her anymore. "Help me?" Grace's voice came out as a whisper, then grew stronger with each word. "Help me process the fact that your family destroyed mine, that everything you have was built on my parents' graves, that I've been falling in love with the enemy without even knowing it." The last words slipped out before she could stop them, hanging in the air between them like a confession and an accusation combined. Will's face crumpled, and she saw her own heartbreak reflected in his eyes. Lily, who had been quietly coloring in the corner, suddenly appeared at Grace's side. The little girl's face was solemn as she pressed a fresh origami crane into Grace's palm, this one folded from black paper, a crane for mourning. "Sometimes," Lily said in her clear, sweet voice, "the saddest stories turn into the most beautiful ones. Mama told me that before she went to heaven." Grace stared down at the child who'd become so dear to her, at the paper crane that represented both ending and beginning, at the impossible situation that love and truth had created. She was facing the hardest choice of her life: let the past consume her future, or find a way to forgive the unforgivable. Mrs. Patterson drew her last breath just as the Charleston church bells chimed 9 o'clock, their sound carrying across the city like a benediction or a warning. Grace wasn't sure which. The days following Mrs. Patterson's funeral passed in a haze of unbearable tension. Grace had moved through the motions of her life: work at Sunset Manor, studying for her nursing boards, the mundane tasks of survival, but everything felt hollow, contaminated by the truth that had shattered her world into pieces she couldn't reassemble. She avoided Palmetto Cafe, couldn't bear the thought of seeing Will's face across that familiar table where they'd built something beautiful on a foundation of lies. Her phone buzzed constantly with his calls and messages, each one more desperate than the last. "Please let me explain. This doesn't change how I feel about you. Don't let my father's sins destroy what we have." But Grace couldn't answer. Every time she looked at her phone, she saw her parents' faces in the old photographs Mrs. Patterson had kept. Young, hopeful, in love with each other, and their dreams of making the world better. Dreams that Charles Harrison had crushed along with their lives. The safety deposit box had yielded its secrets exactly as Mrs. Patterson had promised. Financial documents proving Charles Harrison's embezzlement, correspondence showing how he'd systematically stolen from the research funds meant to develop pediatric medications, and most damning of all, a letter from Grace's father to a federal investigator detailing evidence of fraud that would have destroyed the Harrison family empire. The letter was dated the day before her parents died. Grace had taken the documents to Detective Morrison, the same officer who'd handled Mrs. Patterson's natural death. Morrison was nearing retirement, old enough to remember the original case, and his weathered face had grown grim as he reviewed the evidence. "This paints a very different picture than what we had 16 years ago," he'd admitted. "But the statute of limitations has run out on the financial crimes, and Charles Harrison died 5 years ago. There's not much we can do legally at this point." "What about the murders?" Grace had asked, her voice steady despite the rage burning in her chest. Morrison had shaken his head. "Without more concrete evidence, physical proof of tampering, witness testimony, it would be nearly impossible to prove after all these years. I'm sorry, Miss Sullivan. I know that's not what you want to hear." So there would be no justice, no courtroom vindication, no punishment for the man who'd stolen her parents' lives and their legacy. Just the bitter knowledge that the Harrison fortune had been built on their bones, and that Will, kind, gentle Will, had inherited blood money without knowing its true cost. That knowledge ate at Grace like acid. She found herself lying awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling of her trailer and wondering if every kindness Will had shown her was tainted by unconscious guilt. Had he somehow known? Was that why he'd been drawn to her that night at the Magnolia Room? Not by genuine attraction, but by some twisted form of karmic debt. The questions tormented her, but not as much as the memory of Will's face when the truth had come out. The shock, the horror, the immediate understanding of what this meant for them. He hadn't tried to deny it or minimize it. He'd simply stood there, accepting the weight of his family's sins, looking at her with eyes full of love and loss, and the terrible knowledge that loving someone sometimes meant letting them go. 2 weeks after Mrs. Patterson's death, Grace was restocking medical supplies at Sunset Manor when Dolores found her in the storage closet crying over a box of gauze bandages. "Honey, this has got to stop," Dolores said firmly, her maternal instincts overriding professional boundaries. "You're grieving Mrs. Patterson, and that's natural, but this is something deeper. This is eating you alive from the inside out." Grace wiped her eyes, embarrassed to be caught in such a vulnerable moment. "I'm fine. Just tired." "Don't you lie to me, Grace Sullivan. I've known you for 2 years, and I've never seen you like this. This is about that man, isn't it? The one who brought you here the night Mrs. Patterson passed?" The kindness in Dolores's voice broke something loose in Grace's chest. The whole story came pouring out. The family history, the documents, the impossible position she found herself in. Dolores listened, without judgment, occasionally making small sounds of sympathy or outrage. "So what are you going to do about it?" Dolores asked when Grace finished. "What can I do? I can't unknow what I know now. I can't pretend his family didn't destroy mine." Dolores was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes thoughtful. "Can I tell you something about forgiveness, child? It's not about the other person deserving it. It's about you deserving peace, carrying that anger, that hate. It's like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. But how do I forgive something like this? How do I get past it? You start by asking yourself what your parents would want for you. Would they want you to spend your life consumed by bitterness over something that happened before you were even grown? Or would they want you to take that love you've found and build something beautiful with it? Grace thought about her parents' faces in those old photographs, about the love that had shone so clearly between them. They'd been dreamers, healers, people who'd wanted to make the world better. Would they really want their daughter to sacrifice her own happiness on the altar of their memory? That evening, Grace found herself standing outside Will's mansion on Rainbow Row. The historic house glowed like something from a fairy tale, its pastel walls and wrought iron balconies speaking of old money and older secrets. Through the tall windows she could see warm light and moving shadows. Will and Lily, probably having dinner, probably missing the woman who'd brought joy into their lives before tragedy tore it away again. She almost turned around 3 times before she found the courage to ring the doorbell. When Will opened the door, his face went through a series of expressions: hope, fear, love, resignation, before settling into careful neutrality. "Grace," he said quietly, "I wasn't sure I'd ever see you again." "We need to talk," she said, proud that her voice didn't shake. "There are things I need to say, and things I need to hear." He stepped aside to let her in, and Grace found herself in an elegant foyer that probably cost more than she'd earned in 5 years. But all she could see was Lily's artwork covering the refrigerator in the kitchen beyond, origami cranes scattered on the coffee table, the comfortable mess of a home where a child was loved and cherished. "Lily's upstairs," Will said, following her gaze. "She's been asking about you every day. I didn't know what to tell her." The thought of Lily's confusion, her sense of abandonment, hit Grace harder than any anger over her parents' death. That innocent child didn't deserve to lose another person she'd grown to love, especially not because of sins committed before she was even born. Grace stood in Will's elegant living room, surrounded by the trappings of wealth that had been built on her family's destruction. Yet somehow all she could focus on were the small signs of ordinary life. Lily's crayons scattered on an antique coffee table, a half-finished puzzle spread across the Persian rug, family photographs where Sarah's gentle smile watched over them all. This wasn't the cold mansion of a villain. It was the warm home of a man trying to raise his daughter with love and kindness. "I've been doing research," Grace said quietly, pulling a manila folder from her bag. "About your father's company. About what happened after my parents died." Will's face went pale, but he nodded. "I figured you would. You have every right to know everything." "The company nearly went bankrupt 3 years after the accident," Grace continued, her voice steady despite the emotion churning beneath the surface. "Your father had been using the stolen research funds to cover bad investments. If my parents hadn't died, if their pediatric medication patents had been developed properly, the company would have been worth 10 times what it was when you inherited it." "Grace, let me finish." She opened the folder, revealing financial documents and newspaper clippings she'd spent sleepless nights gathering. "You saved the company. You, Will, not your father's blood money. When you took over 5 years ago, you shifted focus back to pediatric research. You've funded studies into childhood leukemia treatments, genetic disorder therapies, medications for rare diseases that pharmaceutical companies usually ignore because they're not profitable enough." Will stared at her, confusion and hope warring in his expression. "I don't understand what you're saying." "I'm saying you've been trying to fulfill my parents' vision without even knowing it. The work you're doing now, the children you're helping, that's what they dreamed of. That's what they died trying to create." Grace's voice broke slightly. "And you did it. You actually did it." She pulled out a newspaper clipping from 6 months ago, an article about Harrison Pharmaceuticals' breakthrough treatment for a rare genetic disorder that primarily affected children. The headline read, "Local company's new drug offers hope for families facing impossible odds." 87 children received this medication in the first clinical trial, Grace said. 87 families who didn't have to watch their babies die because you chose research over profit, because you chose to be better than your father. Will sank into a chair, his hands shaking as he took the clipping. "You've been investigating me. I've been trying to understand how to live with loving the son of the man who killed my parents. Grace said simply. And what I found is that you're not your father's son in any way that matters. You're the man my parents would have wanted their daughter to love. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of forgiveness and possibility. Will looked up at her with eyes full of tears he was trying not to shed. But how can you forgive this? How can you look at me and not see his crimes? Grace moved closer, kneeling beside his chair. Because I see Lily upstairs, practicing her origami and asking why her friend Grace doesn't visit anymore. Because I see the man who bought dinner for a stranger having the worst night of her life. Because I see the pharmaceutical executive who funds research that doesn't make money but saves lives. Because I see you, Will Harrison, not Charles Harrison's legacy. It doesn't change what happened to your parents. No, it doesn't. And I'll carry that grief for the rest of my life. But I won't let it poison what we have. My parents died believing in the power of healing, of making the world better for children. You're living that dream. You're their legacy just as much as I am. Will reached for her hands, holding them like they were precious and fragile. I've been going crazy these past 2 weeks. I thought I'd lost you forever. I thought you'd hate me. I tried to, Grace admitted. I wanted to hate you because it would have been simpler. But love isn't simple. Forgiveness isn't simple. And sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the darkest soil. They sat in silence for several minutes, holding hands in the lamplight, processing the weight of truth and forgiveness. Then they heard light footsteps on the stairs, and Lily appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleepy eyes. Grace? Lily's voice was small and uncertain. Are you back? Are you staying? Grace felt her heart break and heal simultaneously. She opened her arms and Lily ran into them, small and warm and trusting. Over the child's head, she met Will's eyes. I'm staying, she said, and meant it. I'm staying for as long as you'll have me. But even as she spoke the words, even as Will's face transformed with relief and joy, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something else was watching from the shadows. For 2 weeks, she'd been so focused on the past that she'd failed to notice the present danger creeping closer. Derek Sterling had been very quiet since that humiliating night at the Magnolia Room. Too quiet. And Derek Sterling quiet was infinitely more dangerous than Derek Sterling cruel. Outside, hidden in the magnolia shadows across from the Rainbow Row mansion, Derek lowered his camera and smiled. He'd been documenting Grace's comings and goings for days, building a comprehensive file of her routines, her vulnerabilities, her connections. Tonight's reunion had given him exactly what he needed: the pharmaceutical heiress and the trailer park princess. Oh, his followers were going to eat this story alive, but first he had more personal business to attend to. Grace Sullivan had embarrassed him, made him look foolish, rejected his superiority. No one did that to Derek Sterling and walked away unscathed. No one. As Grace held Lily and planned a future filled with love and healing, Derek Sterling planned revenge. And in Charleston's humid summer night, Spanish moss swayed like funeral shrouds in the breeze, whispering warnings that no one was listening to hear. The weeks that followed Grace and Will's reconciliation felt like a fairy tale, the kind where love conquers all and families are rebuilt from the ashes of tragedy. Grace had moved into the guest cottage on Will's property, maintaining propriety while allowing their relationship to deepen naturally. Lily bloomed under the stability of having Grace as a constant presence, her selective mutism giving way to shy conversations and spontaneous laughter that filled the historic mansion with life. Will had insisted on paying for Grace's nursing school tuition, framing it as an investment in her future rather than charity. "You're going to save lives," he'd said simply. "The world needs more nurses like you." Grace had accepted, finally understanding that love sometimes meant allowing others to support your dreams. They fell into comfortable rhythms, Sunday dinners together, afternoon walks through Charleston's historic district, quiet evenings where Will worked on pharmaceutical research while Grace studied and Lily practiced her origami. It felt like the family Grace had always dreamed of, built from three broken pieces that somehow fit together perfectly. But Derek Sterling had been watching, waiting, planning. The first sign of trouble came on a humid Thursday morning in late June. Grace was walking to her summer nursing program classes when she noticed the same silver sedan she'd seen the day before, and the day before that. It stayed just far enough back to seem coincidental. But Grace's instincts, honed by years of caring for vulnerable nursing home patients, sensed predator behavior. She mentioned it to Will that evening, and he immediately called his security consultant. "We'll have someone check it out," he assured her. "Probably nothing, but better safe than sorry." The second warning came in the form of Derek's blog. Grace discovered it accidentally while researching pediatric medication protocols for a class assignment. The search results included a recent post from Charleston Food Truth titled, "When Trailer Trash Meets Trust Funds, a Modern Cinderella Delusion." The post was vicious in its precision, detailing Grace's background with information only someone who'd been stalking her could know. Her address at Riverside Trailer Park, her job at Sunset Manor, even her parents' death in what Derek described as convenient circumstances that left a certain pharmaceutical fortune intact. He'd somehow obtained photographs of her and Will together, captioned with sneering commentary about gold-digging nurses who prey on grieving widowers. But it was the comments section that made Grace's blood run cold. Dozens of responses from Derek's followers, each more cruel than the last. Suggestions about what should happen to welfare queens who think they're princesses. Speculation about whether Will's charity case was good enough in bed to justify the embarrassment. Threats disguised as jokes about putting her back in her place. Grace showed Will the blog that night, watching his face go through shock, disgust, and finally, cold fury. "This isn't just cyberbullying," he said grimly. "This is stalking. This is targeted harassment designed to isolate you, to make you feel unsafe. What do? We call Detective Morrison. We document everything, and we make sure you're never alone until this is resolved." But Derek was escalating faster than they could respond. The silver sedan became bolder, following Grace to class, to the grocery store, even sitting outside Will's gates for hours at a time. Grace's phone started receiving calls from unknown numbers, sometimes heavy breathing, sometimes cruel laughter, sometimes Derek's voice delivering reviews of her daily activities in the format of his food blog. "Today's special, anxiety-seasoned trailer park princess with a side of false hope," he'd whisper into her voicemail. "Chef's kiss for the tears I know you're crying right now." Will hired private security, but Derek was clever, always staying just within legal boundaries. The police could do little more than file reports and promise to investigate. Charleston society, meanwhile, began to buzz with whispers. Some defended Grace and Will's relationship, but others seized on Derek's narrative, questioning whether the pharmaceutical heiress was truly in love or simply opportunistic. The breaking point came on a sweltering July afternoon. Grace was picking Lily up from summer camp when the little girl came running to the car in tears. "Grace, some man was asking about you," Lily sobbed. "He had a camera and he knew my name, and he said you were going to leave us just like Mama did." Grace felt ice form in her veins despite the Charleston heat. Derek had approached a child, had terrified a 6-year-old girl who'd already lost one mother. This had crossed every line, violated every boundary of decency. That evening, after Lily was asleep, Grace sat Will down for the hardest conversation of their relationship. "He's not going to stop," she said quietly. "As long as I'm in your life, he's going to keep escalating. He's going to keep hurting Lily." "Grace, no." We're not letting him win. Look at what he's already done. He's turned our love story into a public spectacle. He's making Lily afraid. He's threatening our safety, our future, everything we've built together. Grace's voice broke. Maybe everyone's right. Maybe I don't belong in your world. Maybe loving you is selfish if it puts Lily in danger. Will took her hands, his grip desperate. Listen to me. Derek Sterling is a sick man who's using our happiness to feed his own twisted needs. Walking away won't stop him. It'll just prove to him that his tactics work. Is that really the lesson you want to teach Lily? That bullies win if they're cruel enough? Grace looked around the beautiful room that had become home, thought about Lily's laughter and Will's gentle love and the family she'd found after a lifetime of being alone. Then she thought about Derek's escalating behavior, his willingness to involve a child in his revenge fantasies. "What if we can't protect her?" she whispered. "What if he hurts her to get to us?" Will's jaw tightened with a determination Grace had never seen before. "Then we make sure he can't hurt anyone ever again, because I'll be damned if I let that monster destroy another family. We're going to end this, Grace." Together. Outside, hidden in the Spanish moss shadows, Derek Sterling raised his telephoto lens and smiled as he captured their intimate conversation through the window. Phase 1 was complete. He'd isolated Grace, made her question her worth, planted seeds of doubt about her place in Will's world. Now it was time for Phase 2, and Phase 2 involved making sure Grace Sullivan disappeared from Charleston permanently. Some people, Derek thought as he packed his surveillance equipment, just didn't know when they weren't wanted. But he was an excellent teacher, and he was about to give Grace Sullivan the most important lesson of her very short life. The final confrontation came on a suffocating August evening when Charleston's summer heat pressed down like a living thing, thick with humidity and the promise of storms. Grace had been staying at Will's mansion for 3 days since Derek's encounter with Lily, neither of them willing to risk leaving the child alone, even with private security stationed around the property. Detective Morrison had finally gathered enough evidence to issue a restraining order, but everyone knew it was just a piece of paper against a man who'd already shown complete disregard for boundaries. Derek's blog posts had become increasingly unhinged, filled with graphic threats disguised as food reviews. His latest post, titled "Final Service: How to Properly Dispose of Leftovers," had been so explicitly violent that several of his regular followers had actually contacted police with concerns. "He's going to make a move soon," Morrison had warned them that morning. "Men like Sterling, when they feel cornered, they don't retreat. They escalate, and they usually do it when their target feels safest." That target, Grace knew, was her. Derek's obsession had crystallized into a simple equation. If he couldn't have her worship, he would have her terror. And if he couldn't have her terror, he would make sure no one could have her at all. The evening had started peacefully enough. Will was in his study reviewing quarterly reports while Grace helped Lily with a particularly complex origami dragon that required patience and precision, qualities the child had developed in abundance since her mother's death. They sat on the Persian rug in the living room, Lily's small fingers working the paper with the intense concentration she applied to everything that mattered to her. "Grace," Lily said suddenly, looking up from her folding, "do you think bad people can become good people?" The question caught Grace off guard. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart?" "I've been thinking about the man who's been scaring you. About how he used to be a little boy like the ones at my camp, and something must have made him turn mean." Lily's dark eyes held a wisdom that seemed far too old for her 6 years. "Mama used to say that hurt people sometimes hurt other people because they don't know how to make the pain stop." Grace felt her heart constrict with love for this remarkable child who saw the world with such clarity and compassion. "Your mama was a very wise woman." "Yes." I think bad people can become good people if they want to change and if they're willing to do the hard work of healing. Do you think the scary man wants to change?" Before Grace could answer, every light in the house went out. The sudden darkness was complete and disorienting, the kind of blackness that only comes when power fails on a moonless night. Grace's nursing training kicked in immediately. She reached for Lily, pulling the child close while her eyes tried to adjust to the absence of light. "Lily, stay right next to me," she whispered. "Don't move, baby girl." From Will's study came the sound of his chair scraping back, then his voice, calm but alert. "Grace, Lily, everyone stay where you are. I'm calling security." But Grace already knew this wasn't a random power outage. The timing was too perfect, too convenient. Derek had been planning this moment, waiting for the right combination of darkness and vulnerability. And now, he was here. The sound came from the kitchen, a soft scraping, like a window being forced open. Grace's blood turned to ice water in her veins. The security system should have prevented any breach, but Derek was intelligent and determined. He'd found a way in. "Grace." Derek's voice floated through the darkness, conversational and terrifying. "I know you can hear me. We need to have a little chat about your future. Or rather, your lack of one." Lily whimpered against Grace's shoulder, and Grace pressed her hand gently over the child's mouth, not to silence her, but to muffle any sound that might give away their position. Her mind raced through their options. Will's study was too far away, and Derek was between them and any exit. Their best bet was to stay hidden and hope the security team responded quickly to the power outage. "You know, Grace," Derek continued, and she could hear him moving through the house, his footsteps confident in the darkness. "I've been thinking about our little problem, about how you've disrupted the natural order of things. Trailer trash doesn't get to play princess, sweetheart. There are rules, consequences for people who forget their place." A flashlight beam swept across the living room, missing their position behind the couch by mere feet. Grace pressed Lily closer, feeling the child's rapid heartbeat against her chest. In her peripheral vision, she could see the faint glow from Will's study. He was probably using his phone's flashlight, hopefully calling for help. "The thing is," Derek said, his voice growing closer, "I don't think you understand how this story ends. See, in real life, the prince doesn't marry the peasant girl. In real life, the peasant girl learns her lesson and disappears, permanently." The flashlight beam swung toward them again, and this time Grace saw Derek's silhouette in the doorway. Tall, lean, holding something metallic that caught the light. Her heart stopped as she realized it was a knife. "Found you," Derek whispered, and his voice held the satisfied purr of a cat who'd finally cornered its prey. Grace made a split-second decision born of desperation and maternal instinct. She pushed Lily toward the darkest corner of the room and stood up, placing herself between the child and Derek's blade. "You want to hurt someone?" she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Then hurt me. Leave the little girl alone. She's innocent in all this." Derek's laugh was soft and ugly. "Oh, Grace, sweet, stupid Grace, I'm not just going to hurt you. I'm going to make sure Will Harrison watches while I take apart everything he loves, starting with you, ending with his precious daughter. And then I'm going to make sure he knows it's all his fault for thinking he could steal you away from me." The madness in his voice was complete now. The careful facade of the sophisticated food blogger stripped away to reveal the twisted obsession beneath. This wasn't about rejection or humiliation anymore. This was about possession, about power, about a damaged man who decided that if he couldn't control Grace's love, he would control her death. From somewhere in the house came the sound of splintering wood and shouted voices. Security had arrived, but Derek seemed unconcerned, almost pleased by the development. "Looks like we need to speed this up," he said, raising the knife. "Don't worry, Grace. I'll make it quick." Well, relatively quick. But as he moved toward her, something small and white fluttered through the darkness. Lily had thrown one of her origami cranes at Derek's head, a tiny, desperate attempt to protect the woman who'd become her second mother. The paper crane hit Derek in the face, startling him just enough to throw off his aim as Grace lunged forward, grabbing his wrist with both hands. They grappled in the darkness, Derek's superior strength fighting against Grace's desperation and her years of handling combative patients at the nursing home. "Will!" Grace screamed as Derek's free hand struck her across the face, sending stars exploding behind her eyes. "Lily, run!" The living room erupted into chaos. Security lights blazed to life as the backup generator kicked in. Will came charging from his study with a poker from the fireplace, and Lily's terrified screams pierced the air like sirens. Derek, blinded by the sudden light, swung the knife wildly, catching Grace across the shoulder and sending her stumbling backward. Will reached them just as Derek raised the blade for a final strike, bringing the iron poker down across Derek's wrist with a sickening crack. The knife clattered to the floor as Derek collapsed, clutching his broken bones and screaming curses that turned the air blue. Security personnel swarmed the room, followed quickly by paramedics and police. Grace found herself sitting on the Persian rug, bleeding from her shoulder wound, while a paramedic cleaned and bandaged the cut. Across the room, Lily clung to Will like a lifeline, both of them watching as Derek Sterling was loaded onto a stretcher and wheeled away to face charges that would keep him locked up for a very long time. "Is it over?" Lily whispered, her voice small and uncertain. Will looked at Grace, saw the strength in her eyes despite the ordeal they'd just survived, saw the love that had made her willing to die protecting his daughter. "Yes, sweetheart," he said softly. "It's over. We're safe now. We're all safe." But even as the words left his mouth, Will knew that what they'd really won wasn't just safety. It was proof. Proof that their love was strong enough to survive revelation and forgiveness, wealthy enough to withstand outside attack, deep enough to build a real family on. Derek Sterling had tried to destroy them and instead had forged them into something unbreakable. Grace reached for both of them, pulling her chosen family close as Charleston's summer storm finally broke outside, washing the city clean with rain that fell like tears of relief and new beginnings.